Hello again, everybody. This is Fred Krantz from St. Ange coming to you with another episode of Taking the Supply Chain Pulse, where we talk to healthcare supply chain, pharmacy, industry leaders and influencers. And today we have with us two people. We have Abby Roth, the founder of Pure Microbiology, and my colleague, Sharone Wang, who is our pharmacy expert and who is going to ask the questions in this interview that I don't know enough to ask about. So thank you both for being here. Happy to have you here. Abby, why don't you describe your background and how it relates to pharmacy sterile compounding?
I'm a microbiologist by background, and I worked in a contract lab for about 14 years where we would do environmental monitoring, or EM. We would go out in the field, collect samples of air, surface, bring things back to the lab and process them. We also ended up doing some product testing like sterility, endotoxin, and things like that. And I really didn't start getting involved with pharmacy sterile compounding until about 2008. And around that time was when we saw some change in some standards where now these sterile compounding pharmacies were required to collect samples. And I was getting inundated with questions about, where do we collect samples? What do the results mean? And really had to get involved with the pharmacies. And at that point then, I didn't know a whole lot about the standards that governed things. So I had to take a lot of time to learn about, what actually goes on in a pharmacy and what the regulations are so that I was able to help them.
Very good. So what is sterile compounding and who regulates this activity?
So the formal definition of sterile compounding is definitely not glamorous. It really ends up being defined as combining, admixing, diluting, pooling, reconstituting, repackaging, like all of that stuff, or otherwise somehow altering like a drug product that comes from a manufacturer or a bulk drug substance in order to create a sterile preparation to give to a patient. So it's really taking, again, a commercially available drug or a bulk drug, doing some things to it, making some manipulations, and getting something that is specifically made for that patient. Things get tricky with regulations, though, with compounding and who regulates that. And that kind of breaks down into like which group of compounders we're talking about. So when it comes to sterile compounding, we have like the traditional compounder that gets a prescription from a prescriber and makes something for a patient. And that's kind of what we think of as like traditional compounding that happens in the hospital, that happens in a community setting. And under that sort of compounding scenario, it's actually state boards of pharmacy, departments of health that are the ones that are sort of regulating the laws and the standards that are put out there to be followed. On the other side of that, we have what's called an outsourcing facility, and they also do sterile compounding, but they're doing it in more of a manufacturing sense, where they don't have a prescription for a patient and they are essentially manufacturing preparations that then will maybe be purchased by a hospital to be able to be provided to patients.
Interesting. Sharone, I've gone as far as I can go. Can you pick it up from here?
Sure, of course. So, Abby, what you're describing, I think, just for general understanding, is you have sterile compounding maybe at a very localized level, let's say within a pharmacy, within a hospital, and they're doing some type of manipulation. Then you describe this outsourcing facility where they are sterile compounding similar manipulations, but then their customers are, let's say, hospitals, doctors' offices, clinics. And then finally, I would say then you have the drug manufacturer, who they're also somehow manipulating and making some sort of product. So I guess like one question for understanding is what is different about sterile compounding from manufacturing? Are those two similar, or are they actually completely different in the eyes of the law and also in the eyes of the activity that you're actually doing?
Yeah, and they are like really two different things. When we're talking about compounding, we're taking that product that was prepared by the manufacturer, which is an FDA approved drug product. Or we're taking again, a bulk drug substance that's being, purchased and doing what we would consider non-sterile to sterile compounding. So the two are very different. And again, we have like these different levels where the 503A pharmacy, as we'll put it, which is, the term that comes out of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act to kind of define the traditional pharmacy, they're following things like USP 797, which is the United States Pharmacopeia chapter on sterile compounding, and maybe some other like state laws. And then you have the outsourcing facility where they're following, the current good manufacturing practices, or the CGMPs, and they're the ones that are going to be regulated then by the FDA. Where at the same point, Sharon, like when you're talking about the manufacturers, they're also regulated by the FDA. And I think what's wild about that sort of setting is that the sterile compounders that are in these outsourcing facilities that are, again, basically manufacturing compounds, they have to follow the CGMPs, but they get a couple exemptions, and they have a couple different, guidances from the FDA that they end up following. And it's not strict to, the manufacturing expectations that we see with a true drug manufacturer.
I see. So, I mean, it just sounds like there's just, first of all, like multiple regulating bodies for any of these processes. And then it's also that, you really have to define what processes that you're actually doing. And I think that, in this case, I think perhaps in description, it sounds a bit confusing, but I think in practice,
Yep.
What the confines of what you're doing in your facility, whether it's a pharmacy or let's say you're a drug manufacturing plant, obviously they're very different on the day to day. So, it's just very interesting to see, who is regulating what, just to make, and, at the very end of the day, it's really about consumer protections and making sure that products are safe to the public.
I would actually add to that, Sharon, with kind of the note on like the regulatory oversight. The 503B, like outsourcing facilities, a lot of them still have to get licensed by their states. So their state boards of pharmacy are still coming in there, and some of them kind of struggle a little bit in knowing and understanding what should be done in these facilities because they're not really familiar with the CGMPs. So it's a very interesting landscape from a regulatory standpoint.
Yes, it's kind of with on the manufacturer regulatory side, as a pharmacist, that's really something that we don't really come into contact at all in terms of regulations. And as in pharmacy, we're very much governed by, let's say, overarching nationwide, let's say FDA regulations. But in addition, the state plays a really large role. And it's like when you kind of get up into the drug manufacturing level, it's like the state starts exiting and it becomes more of a US, they're encompassed by those regulations. So that's always really good to get an idea of. So, I mean, we've been talking about those USP standards, and I think one thing that's really happened in the pharmacy world is that they were actually recently updated, and they were updated late last year. And that's something that commonly happens. Obviously, regulations and standards, they really should be updated. On a pretty continuous basis, just so that way we're all keeping up to date with all the new technologies and any new findings that are discovered. And so, can you give me some examples of maybe some major changes, and then how did those changes impact pharmacies?
Sure. So we probably can put all of that into like four big
Sure.
buckets, I'd kind of say. One of the biggest changes was related to beyond use states, or the BUDs. And with that, we saw actually the beyond use states become more strict, and not just kind of allowing these much longer dates based off of just drug stability alone, but really trying to tighten things up with the sterility concerns that we might have, right? So there were major changes to BUDs where we had operated previously under what we would consider like low risk, medium risk, and high risk compounding. And that was all based on how many manipulations did we do and how many containers were we using. And that has completely gone away, which has thrown people for a major loop, some of them, because we now have what are called categories, and we have category 1, 2, and 3. And some folks are just trying to say, oh, well, low risk is category 1, and it's like, not so fast. That's not quite how it works. And a lot of that then ties into the next bucket, which is facility design, where we have the opportunity for like a segregated compounding area, which is where we would perform category 1 compounding, where we have short beyond use states. Then we have the clean room suite, and that really got, I think, more defined in the new version of the chapter. And in there, we can do category 2 and 3 compounding, so we can get some longer beyond use states. So there was a lot of changes with facility. There was a lot of things in that section that sort of just cleaned up with better defining things like air changes per hour and pressure differentials, and some of the sort of just engineering control pieces that maybe weren't quite as clear in the previous chapter. We did have also a lot of changes to the viable sample collection, so collecting air and surface samples. Again, what sort of threw people a little bit was the increased frequency on surface sampling. We went from surface sampling being done periodically, and Sharone, if you can define periodically for me, that would be amazing, because I didn't know what it meant. So a lot of times people were just defaulting to like, oh, well, we'll do it every 6 months like we do air.
Right.
And now for the bulk of people, it's going to, being done monthly. And that has really, really thrown, people for training needs and some things like that. And, the last bucket I will mention here would be training and competency. We really got some great information in 797 now, much better defining competency assessments, training expectations. And maybe one of the coolest things in the chapter was a lot of the training now, the pharmacies could define themselves. And it wasn't so much kind of hitting the easy button and following what's in the chapter, but based on your work practices and your workflow and your facility design, you could design training to meet needs. And it was actually a really great ad. It kind of scares some people because it puts all of the power in their hands. But, for other locations, it'll take some pressure off where you don't have to train everybody on everything.
Right. I mean, I think that, with the changing of those standards, it wasn't just one thing that I think pharmacies, let's say, had to react to. The four large buckets that you really described, it's like a combination of all of that, which really started dictating, how pharmacies could respond to that. So, for example, let's say you're in a pharmacy and let's say you're not meeting those facility requirements. Well, now, you're going to need to do capital costs to update those facility requirements. So, for example, you had mentioned air changes per hour. If you're beneath the minimum, then you're going to need to get back up to standard. But some of those fixes, they're not a switch of a button and you do it. They're very large, let's say, renovation projects. And so, when you're on the pharmacy side and you're thinking, okay, I have to completely, let's say, restructure my clean room because it now needs to be up up to standards. Then comes the question, do you even have the staff or do you even have the volume to make, let's say, the monthly air sampling worthwhile or the monthly surface sampling worthwhile? And so I want to try to explain that it's not really just one thing. I think pharmacies, when they look at the new updated standards, we're really seeing how it all ties in together, because
Oh,
essentially
yeah.
it's like one portion really affects another portion, which really affects another portion. So it's like, now you're at that same pharmacy and you're realizing, okay, my air changes are not meeting the standard and I have to, renovate the whole entire pharmacy. But then you look at your staffing and then you realize, like, well, I really probably don't even make that many IVs, per day. And then it just
Yep.
turns into okay, well, are we really going to continue trying to make, let's say, category 2 products? Should we go back down to category 1 products? Does that fit our needs better? So it's almost like
Yep.
these new
Oh,
standards,
absolutely.
they really just shifted, just a lot of thinking, I think, in our operations. And we're just, constantly considering, how do these standards make sense for each facility? And I think that was interesting too, where it's almost like when you read through the standards, it's like the standards, they give you an ability to basically use it for your facility in a way that makes sense for your facility. So the standards don't push you to say, oh, you must continue to make category 2 products. It's basically telling you, does category 2 products even make sense to you? And it's not like the USPs are taking away from your complete ability to make sterile compounds. It's just that it just
Yeah.
defined it a bit more.
I think that's a great point that you make with that, where, again, the chapter opened up so much flexibility for you, right? And gave you the ability to look at your operations and workflow. And like you said, make those decisions. Do I want a clean room? Maybe not, and
Mhm.
looking at especially some places in like infusion clinics or oncology centers where they don't need a full clean room suite. They can operate quite well on a segregated compounding area, because pretty much the patient comes in, says, maybe run a couple blood tests or, whatever, check a
Mhm.
couple things for that patient and say, oh, yeah, we're good. We'll go make you your drug and we'll get it to you in like half an hour. It's not like the drugs need to sit around for a long period of time and need a longer date. So, your point on that is 100% like spot on. USP really did try to make this a lot more flexible to meet a lot of different workflows and work environments, and leave some decision making up to the pharmacy for what's actually best for them.
Sure. I think that, and I think, coming from USPs, I'm sure their perspective, it's like they would have rather had, let's say, a clean room that was truly functioning more of a clean room with appropriate BUDs than, let's say, a facility that, your air changes aren't really up to par, your surface sampling isn't really up to par, but you're still churning out products that you're putting a beyond use date of an extended period of time. And I think that's they're trying to kind of hedge some of that risk in doing that. And so they're basically saying for those facilities that where their clean rooms are not really, let's say, the best of standards, they're basically saying you may need to just go ahead and demote to a segregated compounding area, because we'd rather you do that and put shorter beyond use dates on, so that way we can, protect our patients and protect the public. It's
Yeah,
kind of what it seems like the logic came to.
absolutely.
So speaking of some of this, I'm always curious to see, how other countries around the world are doing the same, are doing, and I'm wondering, do they follow similar things? Do they have their own similar guidelines or regulations, or how influential is USP? I would say worldwide.
I mean, generally speaking, USP as a whole is followed throughout the entire world, right? Even though it's
So,
marked as a United States Pharmacopeia, we see its use internationally. And then there are other pharmacopoeias out there, um, like Japan has one, and so on. But as far as USP 797 goes, or the other compounding chapters, we do see some of those being adopted, like Australia, the United Arab Emirates. Like, they've definitely adopted USP 795, which was for non-sterile compounding, 797 for sterile, and USP 800 for hazardous drug handling. I think what's interesting too is like our neighbors up north in Canada, they have their own standards, which come from the National Association of Pharmacy Regulatory Authorities, which is NAPRA. And what they have done is put together similar standards where it's the same kind of concept of doing like non-hazardous sterile preparations, hazardous sterile preparations, and then they have one on non-sterile. So it's very similar to what we have. And those were drafted based off of maybe unfortunately the last version of 797 in 2008. So some of the things kind of aren't quite up to the same level as what we do in the United States, but they also put their own twist on some of those as well. As far as like Europe goes, it's sort of like the United States there, where different countries have some different regulations, and some of them are a little bit more of a GMP feel than what we see here in the United States. I think a good example of that is in the United Kingdom. They have a couple of agencies and regulatory bodies there where one of them, which is Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, they kind of put out the overall regulations and some guidance that are out there. And really they are expecting adherence to good manufacturing practices. So that's totally different than what we do in the United States, where it's like, pharmacy, like no GMP, we want to have nothing to do with that, especially like I said, in that traditional compounding setting. And then they have also the General Pharmaceutical Council, where they will do some more of the regulatory or overseeing of some of the standards, but they'll also put out some information as well. So, it's different. And I don't know, I just think it's fascinating how the United States has not kind of quite adopted some of the same GMP mindset, even though some of those concepts are excellent and really should apply to what we do.
Yeah, I mean, with US, I think, US healthcare is always, we're always at the forefront of technology, and we're also on the forefront of spending as well. And so it's always very interesting to see, like, especially if a lot of other countries, they're looking at our healthcare models, if they're looking at even our facility design. And so I always wonder about that. And I know that, a lot of, obviously other countries, and just, if you see something really good, you want to, let's say, adopt that, lift it, adopt it into your own country, and do those processes. And so USP, that being so pervasive in the US, and I know once again, when the standards recently updated, we were all kind of like scrambling around to, make sure that we were in compliance with everything. But from what you say, it sounds like other countries, it probably affected them as well, when they were also having to conform to the new standards. So and then of course, Europe, the fact that they're more, let's say, GMP leaning, that's very interesting to me, because that seems very. And for the record, I think for our audience, GMP tends to be a bit more strict than USP standards. And so you would think that perhaps, the more strict you go especially in terms, if you're talking about sterile products, that should probably, I think logically, that seems to make more sense to be going in that direction. So it's kind of interesting where we sit in terms of around the world. I guess one question I also have for you is, based on your experience, and I think I know that you have had a lot of experience looking at different guidelines and kind of trying to figure out, which ones would work really well for these environments. For you, in an ideal clean room setting, what procedures would you like to see performed in the sterile compounding process?
I don't know if there's anything like specific that I would say that's like missing from what needs to happen in the day-to-day that I see, but where we tend to be lacking a lot of times is with a focus on contamination control, right? Because we're working in these environments where we're producing sterile medications, but we know that environment is not truly going to be a sterile environment. We have to really work on preventing microbes from getting in. So ideally, like I really would love to see facilities spending a lot more time focusing on like their material transfer process, because we're bringing things from outside of the clean room inside, and I don't know where those things were before they got here, right? A lot of our
Mhm.
products may come from overseas. They're sitting on a dock for a while and then they're making their way to a warehouse, and really thinking about the logistics of how those materials are getting to us, how they're being stored, and all of the microbes that might be coming along with them, and trying to be sure that we're doing a great job wiping those materials with appropriate agents to kind of limit some of that. Um, Along with that too, it's like garbing. We actually didn't mention this yet, but like 797 is a minimum standard. Like if you follow
Mm.
exactly what's in that standard, you're a C student. And for, I think, many of us, we're looking to do more than that. And the chapter allows you to go above and beyond and to do more. And a great
Okay.
example of that is with garbing. Like we're only required to wear um, like a clean room gown. So it doesn't fully enclose our body. So we're still shedding particles and like making a mess. So it really would be great to be able to have a lot more places be like, you know what? We're going to put on a coverall, or as some of us call them, bunny suits, right? And
Mm.
enclose everything that we have. So we're trying to limit our impact on the space and really drive that contamination control point home. So, that's really something that I would love to see that the sterile compounding pharmacies take a lot more time to work towards implementing.
Yeah, and I think, in that same vein, um, for the next go around, as far as revisions to the USP standards, what trends do you predict will be included in that next set? Oh, well, hopefully, well, I think it's coming the next 8 years, 10 years, 5 years.
Well, yes, we waited a very long time for changes this go round. We had
Yes,
had one come out for sterile compounding in 2008, and now it was 2023 till we finally got, the
right.
next chapter being official. Um,
Hmm.
it's a process. I mean, I had the honor of serving on the USP committee the last cycle, so there's so much that goes into revising these chapters. Uh, One of the things that I would expect to see, maybe not in the next cycle of the USP committee, um, well, they're not touching 797 and 795 for a while, I don't think. Those are not going to be touched. But the interesting thing that we have kind of going right now is that USP 800, which was on the handling of hazardous drugs, like in the healthcare settings, that
Mm.
came out in 2016. So some of the language that was in the 2008 version of 797 didn't jive with the 2016 800. And now we have the same problem where what's in 800 doesn't quite match up with what's in the new version of 795 and 797. So
Mhm.
to answer your question, I think we're probably, hopefully, going to see some changes to USP 800 in the next
Okay.
coming couple of years. And I don't know that it's going to be anything that's going to be making it more stringent or more difficult. 800 just needs a lot of clarification information. And actually, there are some things that could get dialed back and actually make the chapter a little bit more user-friendly.
Hmm.
The other thing that I think we might end up hopefully seeing is we actually have a quality assurance in pharmaceutical compounding chapter, which is 1163. And I'm not sure that a whole lot of folks know that that exists, but it's an informational chapter, and that's definitely due for an overhaul. So I'm hoping, as far as like USP compounding revisions, that one gets touched very soon, and we'll kind of then be able to take the what's in 797 and explain the hows, because
Mm.
797 tells us what to do, but it usually doesn't tell us how to do anything.
Right.
So getting some support in another chapter would be amazing.
Right, right, right. And I think sometimes on the pharmacy side, the way that we interpret it, we kind of do it and we're like, does this meet Does this meet what 797 is trying to
Yep.
say? Yes, I think sometimes that there's a bit of a interpretation that is also confusing for pharmacists, and sometimes related to regulations. It would be nice if it was just very straightforward and very like obvious about how to do it. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's very interesting that with the new guidelines. So I mean, this last go around was pretty earth-shattering, I know, for in the pharmacy world. And just to give our audience a background, I mean, it's like it came out. I think they first did kind of like a soft preview where they announced it to the world, like, "Hey, we're gonna change it." And then I know that there was the response was there was such a strong response from the pharmacy community that they had to put it on hold for a little bit, and then they resumed it in 2023. So and unveiled the final product, I should say.
Yeah.
So, and we're all still adjusting to it. I think I know the initial like first 6 months or first year, oh man, it was a rough time for us all because we were really just, I mean, trying to digest just the new information. And obviously everyone in pharmacy, we want to be compliant. We want to do what's best for the patients, but we also wanted to interpret the new standards correctly.
Yeah, and that takes time and money,
Exactly. Exactly.
because a lot of the changes did result in either needing additional staff or, like
Hmm.
we were talking before, funding for renovations, or just now being able to, like, the competency tests for most people went from annually to every 6 months, which is
Hmm.
doubling a huge, workload for whoever's administering those. So yeah,
Sure.
definitely
Yeah.
was a big change.
You had talked about competency, and I know that we had recently attended the an American Pharmacy Association, American Association for Healthcare Pharmacists, a presentation, and I remember in one of those they were talking about the competency, even shifting versus like pass fail. I think some of our traditional ways of doing competencies to maybe do it more on a graded scale of
Mhm.
some of our procedures. And, I think even that was just different thinking because we are trying to adjust and adapt to the new USP standards.
You guys have stimulated some thoughts in my head, which is not necessarily a good thing. But um, I got one comment for you, Abby, and a question that you're not going to be expecting. So, the first comment I have is for both of you folks. Um, I'm a supply chain generalist. So, suppose I was at the Cedar Crest campus over there at Lehigh Valley Health Network, where I used to be at one time anyway, and I decided, well, I think I want to build a consolidated service center in Lower Macungie, and I think I want to throw the pharmacy in there too. I would realize from listening to this presentation that I needed to know a lot of stuff before I made any decisions. And we have two different types of expertise present in today's session. We have Sharone, who is a pharmacy operations specialist, and we have you that's a microbiology specialist, to take care of avoiding all the really hazardous mistakes and processes in design. I think we have another session that we've identified here that would be just a good session about, hey, I'm thinking about putting my pharmacy operation in a consolidated service center. What do I need to do? I think you guys could do a great job, and I'd love to have another session with you about that. Does that sound fair?
Yeah.
Sure. Sounds great.
And now for the big question that you're not expecting. Abby, how has your experience as a microbiologist helped you as a youth soccer coach?
Oh, well, so that's a good question, and I actually have an answer for you on that one. Um, Having coached like 5-year-olds, they're unpredictable. Microbes are unpredictable. So Um, definitely having that microbiology background where you don't know what to expect from those microorganisms. Maybe they're going to grow today, maybe they're not going to grow today. It was the same as coaching 5-year-olds where, you know what, is uh is Amelia going to decide that she wants to play soccer today, or is she going to sit down in the middle of the field and we're going to try to figure out how to still have a good time? And that's really my takeaway from micro and how I've kind of applied that to coaching kids too. You just kind of have to go with it.
A follow-up question then is, do microbes always run toward the ball no matter what they're supposed to do?
Oh, no. They stay in their position, Fred.
There you go. So if you've ever seen 5-year-olds playing soccer, it doesn't matter no matter what's going on, wherever the ball is, that's where they are.
That's right.
Well, Abby, it's been great having you on the episode, and like I say, I think there's a lot of subject matter here that we could get into another discussion about, because it just jumps out to me, being a generalist, that if I want to try to do something, I need to have a lot of good information before I can commit, and pharmacy, it's even more so than just figuring out how big of a warehouse you need to design to accommodate med-surg distribution. It's a lot different. So thanks so much for joining us. I hope you have a great weekend. Sharone, thanks for your expertise as always. And we'll see everybody again in another episode of Taking the Supply Chain Pulse. Thank you. Thanks again, everybody, for listening to our podcast, Taking the Supply Chain Pulse. Subscribe, follow, and give us your comments for topics or improvements. And if you know some people that you think we should be interviewing, please tell us about them too. I can be reached at fcrans, C-R-A-N-S, at stonge, STONGE.com. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks again. See you next time.